All right, this is the last day of notes on linear regression. And basically, we're going to be covering 212, page 212 in the note spiral. And if we would turn all the way back, though, to 202, we need to make sure that we have all that data from 202 in the calculator. And I'm going to real quickly review the calculator. So I have my data already entered. And then I need to go ahead and get the residuals put in. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go stat, calc. Well, first off, I'm going to clear the screen. So second quit, clear the screen. Then I'm going to do a stat, calc, and I'm going to do a number 8 for linear regression. Second 1 for L1, because that's where my X list is. Second 2 for L2, because that's where my Y list is. And I'm going to drop down to store regression equation, all right? This is really important that you press alpha, followed by the word trace, and then press enter, and it should have Y1 up on the screen. If you don't have this, something else is not going to work for you later. All right, at that point, I hit enter a couple times, and there's my regression equation. So Y hat equals $177.21. plus 0.0786x. We have the R squared, or coefficient of determination, of 0.482, and we have the R, or correlation coefficient, of 0.69. All right, so we have all that information, but now I want to go back and I want to go ahead and get my residuals in. So I'm going to go back to stat edit, so stat, edit, and the top of L3, I'm going to put my residuals. All right. So at this point, I go up to L3, I arrowed up, L3 is now highlighted, and I'm going to press second, followed by the stat or list button. And then I'm going to arrow down, and it's going to be different on each calculator. Usually it's going to be like number 6 or number 7 or number 8, but I'm looking for the word resid for residual. I press enter, and then I press enter a second time, and that should populate all of my residuals at that point. Okay, so now we have all of our residuals populated, and we're going to move back on to 212. Now on 212, we have a computer printout, and I'm going to let you know that on your test, well, first off, on your quiz on Monday and on your test, you're going to have a computer printout. So we kind of need to be able to find things on the printout. The printout's really easier to use. All the data has been calculated. You don't have to worry about a data entry error. Usually there's a scenario at the top of the page. We are continuing with our distance and airfare scenario. So it would be normally at the top of the page and it'd say what it is. And so the very first thing it asks us to find is the explanatory variable. They're really nice about that. They always tell us what our explanatory variable is, which in this case is distance. All right, so our distance is our explanatory variable. Then it asks for the response variable. This is where you're going to have to go back and read the scenario. Well, the scenario talked about airfare and distance. So in this case, even though we don't see it, we know from our previous day's work that our response variable was airfare. Then it says identify the slope of the regression line. Well, the slope of the regression line is going to be directly across from the variable, so right next to it. So if you identify distance, the number next to it is 0.0786. So that's the slope of my regression line right there. Identify the y-intercept. Be careful here. Look for the word constant, and the number next to where it says constant is the y-intercept. All right? That's where that is. Then it says write the regression equation. Well, that's fairly easy. Y hat equals $177.21 plus 0.0786x. I cannot stress to you enough, you need to make sure you're using Y hat. Y hat is extraordinarily important because this is a prediction model. This is not the actual. This is not actual values. This is a prediction model. It says calculate the degrees of freedom. Well, I'm going to look on the residual line, and I'm going to look for DF, and residual in DF is at 16. Whatever this number is, add 2 to it. All right, so in this case, 16 plus 2 is 18, so my sample size was 18, and I could go back and look at all the sample pairs, count them all up, and there were 18 of them. So that means my sample size was 18. You don't need to know what degrees of freedom are right now. You just need to know that that's the sample. That's how that tells you the sample size.
Wait, can you explain why you add the 2 again?
Not right now. Please do not interrupt the recording.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Identify the standard deviation of the residuals. How it can be calculated using the values from the printout. First off, they're really nice to you. They give you that value. That is the standard deviation of the residuals. But what would you do if they didn't give it to you? All right. All you need to do is you take 27,980 and you divide it by 16. So the 27,980 divided by 16, well, that happens to equal 1,748.79. So it happens to equal this value. If you take the square root, now do this please for me, take the square root of 1,748.79. And when you take the square root of that, you end up getting S equal to 41.82. All right? So basically taking the square root of this value right here gives you that value. The next thing is going to ask you for, it asks for the T statistic. We don't need to know this for this test. You will not need to know this till the spring. It'll ask you for the p-value. You do not need to know it for this test. You'll need to know it for the spring. So what is the correlation coefficient? Well, I look on this table and I don't see it. All right, I don't see it. But if I come over and take the square root of 0.482, please do that. Take the square root of 0.482. That'll give you the numerical portion of the correlation coefficient. That gives you the numerical part of the correlation coefficient, but it doesn't tell you whether it's positive or negative. To check for the positive or negative, you need to look at the slope. If the slope is positive, then the correlation coefficient is positive. If the slope is negative, then the correlation coefficient is negative. Slope is positive, correlation coefficient is positive. Slope is negative, correlation coefficient is negative. Once again, the square root of, not 48.2, but the square root of 0.482. All right, so turn that percent into a decimal. All right. If it asks you to find the coefficient of determination, they're asking for R squared. That's very easy. So immediately my students go, Mr. Spencer, what's R squared adjusted? Nothing that we will study this entire year in this class. They put it there to confuse you. Ignore it. We will not use it at all year long. Okay? The last thing that they're going to ask you for is the standard error of the coefficient, which isn't on this particular page. It didn't ask you to do it. But the standard error is right here. So looking on the slope line, find standard error. In this case, it's 0.0204. All right, so this is standard error of the coefficient. And you're like, well, Mr. Spencer, what do I need to know this for? Well, I'm going to jump back several pages to the sentences that we talked about, page 206. And on the sentences that we talked about, we scroll all the way down at the very bottom. It says the standard error of the slope. So the standard error of the slope is 0.024. Because the slope is estimated from the sample, other samples are likely to have differing slopes. The standard error of the slope quantifies the amount of variation in sample slopes that could be expected from different slopes. And you're like, well, Mr. Spencer, I'm not sure I understand that. And I'm going to say basically what it means is we found a standard deviation. We're calling it a standard error. We found a standard deviation, and that's just how much and since we took a sample, we know that our samples vary. And so it's going to, hey, it could be as much as this much off or as much as this much below. Just tells you how much the slope might vary by. Now, all these sentences on page 206, ultimately you're going to probably need to memorize. but not for this test or for this quiz. Why? It's virtual, so you'll have access to the material. So you're not going to have to memorize it for this test or this quiz, but I'm going to let you know the sentence structures right here, the sentence templates, are going to be the ones that you will need to be successful on your test and quiz. On Friday of next week, that's when your test will be outside of class again. And it'll be 10 to 13 multiple choice questions and 1 free response. And that's it. All right. It's not going to be 2 days. It's just 1 day for this. This is such a short unit. So at any rate, this concludes the notes for this entire unit. I'm not saying you won't have questions that will need to be answered, and I know I have some to answer now, but that will conclude the notes for this entire unit.